Liberation of the vampire. A journey from darkness to light. Have you ever wondered if a vampire, a creature cursed with immortality and darkness, could ever find liberation? The image of a vampire is typically associated with shadows, eternal thirst, and desperate loneliness. But what if liberation is not about escaping death, but about releasing the inner curses? Can a vampire free itself from its dark nature and return to the light? In this story, we explore not just a supernatural being, but a mystical spiritual journey. This is the story of Kael, a vampire who has lived for centuries in isolation, constantly facing tragedies, until he encounters a mysterious woman, a monk with the ability to see the darkness in one's soul. It is she who helps him realize a profound truth. Liberation does not come from fleeing the darkness, but from confronting it and finding the light within yourself. Can Kael release the dark desires, overcome the fear of immortality, and find true freedom? Join us as we explore his miraculous journey, from darkness to light, from death to rebirth. In the story, The Vampire and the Path to Liberation. Vampire Kael and the Curse of Immortality. Kael, a vampire for over 3 centuries, has witnessed countless horrors. Born into a noble family, Kael was once an ambitious young man, living in luxury and indulgence. But everything changed when the woman he loved, Elena, was accidentally killed by him during his first bloodthirst. This grief led him to lose himself, unable to endure the loneliness and pain of a vampire's eternal existence without an end. From that moment on, Kael was trapped in a cycle of punishment and suffering. Despite his infinite strength and immortality, he could not escape the intense thirst for blood, never finding peace in his soul. The long nights passed, and he no longer knew what was real and what was illusion. Every evening, when the moonlight bathed the earth, Kael would wander in the shadows, searching for life to sustain his existence. He had tried every means to free himself, but the more he searched, the deeper he sank into the mire of mistakes and sorrow. The encounter with the mysterious woman. One night, as he wandered through a silent forest, Kael encountered a woman. She stood beneath a large tree, moonlight spilling down, casting a soft, ethereal glow on her face. She was not afraid to see Kael, the vampire. On the contrary, she smiled gently and met his gaze without fear. Her eyes held a deep patience, as if she had been waiting for him for a long time. "You no longer need to wear a mask," she said, her voice soft yet powerful. Kael was surprised and couldn't understand why a human would look at him without trembling in fear. Normally, when he entered a room, everyone would feel a chill and fear him. But not this woman. "Who are you?" Kael asked, his voice hoarse, a mixture of curiosity and unease. She smiled and replied, "I am a seeker of truth. I have come to show you the path you have forgotten." Kael didn't understand. His whole life had been spent in darkness, unable to see the light, unable to find a way to escape the vampire curse. And now, a woman stood before him, saying that she could show him the way to liberation. The teachings of the monk. The woman, named Liara, was a monk, a person who lived outside the world, dedicating her life to understanding the nature of the universe and spiritual transformation. Liara was no ordinary person. She had the ability to see through the true nature of all beings, including souls trapped within bodies like Kael's. She understood that whether vampire or human, we are all bound by fear and desire. And unless we transcend these, we will never truly find liberation. "You are not a monster," Liara said. "You are a soul buried in desires that can never be satisfied. You do not have to live forever in darkness. Kael, death comes only when we let go of everything. But you have not let go. You hunger for life, even if it is but a shadow." Kael listened to these words, unable to stop thinking. He could not remember how many times he had sought death, only to be gripped by fear and continue living, trapped in an endless thirst and pain. Liara taught Kael profound lessons about letting go. Liberation does not come from avoiding death, but from understanding that death is a part of life. We can only be free when we learn to let go of everything, not just the body, but the soul as well. The journey to self-liberation. Kael began his journey. No longer did he run from the truth of himself. Instead, he began facing himself, confronting the darkness within his heart. Every night, Kael meditated, seeking peace in his soul, learning to control his thirst and facing the pain instead of fleeing from it. Liara stayed by his side, guiding him through each challenge. She not only taught him about mindfulness, but also helped him understand that every time he overcame a challenge, he liberated not only himself but also lightened the darkness in the world around him. One night, Kael dreamt of Elena. The pain in his heart resurfaced. But instead of running from it as he had before, he stood before Elena and looked into her eyes. He no longer felt hatred or pain. He simply felt peace. And when Elena smiled, Kael realized that he had forgiven himself. From darkness to light, after many months of practice, Kael no longer felt the bloodthirst that once overtook him. He had learned to live in harmony with his nature without letting it control him. He no longer felt the need to kill to sustain his life. Instead, he came to see life as something sacred and precious. One morning, as the sunlight poured down, Kael stood at the edge of the forest, facing the sun for the first time in centuries. He felt an unusual peace spread throughout his heart. The light did not burn him, rather, it enveloped him in warmth and serenity. Kael had truly liberated himself, not from immortality, but from the chains of his soul. He was no longer a vampire. He had become a human, both in body and spirit. Kael becomes a god. After Kael found peace within himself and began recognizing the transformation within, something miraculous happened. He was no longer just an immortal being. He had become someone who could share light and liberation with lost souls. His understanding of life and death transformed him into a powerful and wise guide. One evening, as Kael meditated beneath a sacred tree, he felt the presence of a soul. It was a spirit trapped in regret. Much like Kael had once been, the soul could not move forward because of its pain from past mistakes. As the spirit approached, Kael felt no fear. On the contrary, he felt deep empathy. "You are not evil," Kael said gently. "You are just a soul lost in darkness, like I once was." The spirit looked up, eyes full of tears. "I cannot forgive myself. What I have done cannot be undone. Nothing is beyond repair," Kael replied. "Forgiving yourself is the first step to liberation. When you let go of regret, you will see that compassion and forgiveness are the true path to freedom." Kael was no longer bound by fear and desire. He knew that forgiveness was the key to unlocking the door to liberation. After helping the spirit recognize the value of forgiveness, Kael saw a light flash in its eyes. The spirit began to leave its body, ascending and merging with the universe, completely free of suffering. This was the first time Kael felt the true power of liberation. He no longer felt alone. With each soul he helped, he felt his own soul grow brighter. Not only was he helping those trapped in darkness, but he was also finding himself in every act of service. The great transformation. With the lessons learned from Liara and his own experiences, Kael began sharing his philosophy of liberation with those he encountered. He was no longer a vampire who only drank blood and lived in shadows. He became a teacher, a guide, a person who pointed the way to inner peace. A small village, where Kael had chosen to reside, slowly transformed under his influence. The villagers lived in peace, no longer fearing supernatural creatures or ancient curses. They felt a strange and soothing energy in the air, and that was the energy of transformation that Kael had brought. One day, as Kael meditated beneath an ancient tree, he felt the presence of another soul. Vampire's liberation. A journey from darkness to light. Have you ever thought that a vampire, a creature cursed with immortality and darkness, could find liberation? Vampires are often associated with the darkness, with eternal longing and despairing loneliness. But what if liberation isn't about escaping death, but letting go of the internal curses that bind us? Can a vampire free himself from the darkness within and return to the light? In this story, we explore not just a supernatural being, but a mystical spiritual journey. This is the story of Kael, a vampire who has lived through centuries of loneliness, faced unrelenting tragedy, until he encounters a strange woman, a monk with the ability to see the darkness in the soul. She helps him realize a shocking truth. Liberation does not come from fleeing the darkness, but from facing it and finding the light within. Can Kael let go of his dark desires, overcome his fear of immortality, and find true freedom? Let's explore his miraculous journey. From darkness to light, from death to rebirth. In the story of the vampire and the path to liberation, Kael the Vampire and the Curse of Immortality. Kael, a vampire who has lived for over 3 centuries, has witnessed countless horrors. Born into an aristocratic family, Kael was once an ambitious young man, living in luxury and pleasure. But everything changed when a woman he loved, Elena, was accidentally killed by him during his first bloodlust. This pain caused him to lose himself, and he could no longer bear the solitude and suffering of his endless vampire life. From that moment, Kael fell into a vicious cycle of punishment and pain. Despite his limitless power and immortality, he could not escape the relentless thirst for blood and never found peace in his soul. The long nights passed, and he could no longer tell where the truth ended and where illusions began. Each night, when the moonlight shone on the earth, Kael wandered in the darkness, searching for life to sustain his existence. He tried every way to free himself, but the more he searched, the deeper he felt trapped in the quagmire of his mistakes and pain. The encounter with the mysterious woman. One night, while wandering through a quiet forest, Kael came across a woman standing beneath a large tree, bathed in the soft moonlight. She was not afraid when she saw Kael, a vampire. Instead, she smiled gently and looked directly into his eyes. Her gaze held no fear, only a profound patience, as though she had been waiting for him for a long time. "You don't need to wear a mask anymore," she said, her voice soft but filled with power. Kael was taken aback, unable to understand how a human could see him without fear. Usually, when he entered a place, people felt a chill of terror. But she wasn't like that at all. "Who are you?" Kael asked, his voice hoarse, a mix of curiosity and unease. The woman smiled. "I am a seeker of truth. I have come to show you the path that you have forgotten." Kael was confused. His entire life had been spent in darkness, unable to see the light, unable to find a way to escape the vampire curse. And now, a woman appeared before him, claiming she could show him the path to liberation. The teachings of the monk. The woman, named Liara, was a monk, someone who lived outside the world, dedicating her life to understanding the nature of the universe and spiritual transformation. Liara was no ordinary person. She had the ability to see through the essence of all beings, including souls trapped within bodies like Kael. She knew that whether vampire or human, we are all bound by our fears and desires. And unless we overcome them, we will never find true liberation. "You are not a monster," Liara said. "You are a soul buried beneath insatiable desires. You do not have to live forever in darkness." "Kael, death only comes when we let go of everything. But you are not letting go, you still crave life, even if it is just a shadow of what it once was." Kael listened to her words, unable to stop thinking. How many times had he sought death, only to fear it and continue living in unquenchable desire and endless pain? Liara taught Kael profound lessons about surrender. Liberation does not come from fleeing death, but from understanding that death is a part of life. We can only be free when we learn to let go of everything. Not just our bodies, but our souls. The journey of self-liberation. Kael began his journey. He no longer ran from the truth of who he was. Instead, he faced himself, confronting the darkness within. Each night, Kael meditated, seeking stillness in his soul, learning to control his bloodlust and confront his pain rather than escape it. Liara never left his side, always guiding him through challenges. She didn't just teach him mindfulness, she helped him understand that each time he overcame a trial, he not only liberated himself, but also helped lessen the darkness in the world around him. One night, Kael met Elena in a dream. The pain in his heart resurfaced, but instead of fleeing as he had before, he stood there, facing Elena, and gazed into her eyes. He no longer felt hatred or anguish. He only felt peace, and when Elena smiled, Kael realized he had forgiven himself. From darkness to light, after a long period of practice, Kael no longer felt the overwhelming thirst for blood. He had learned to live in harmony with his nature without being controlled by it. He no longer felt the need to kill to survive, but instead saw life as something sacred and precious. One morning, as the sunlight broke through the trees, Kael stood at the edge of the forest, facing the sun for the first time in centuries. He felt a strange peace spreading through his heart. The light did not burn him, but enveloped him in warmth and serenity. Kael had truly liberated himself, not from immortality, but from the shackles of his soul. He was no longer a vampire. He had become human, not just in body, but in soul. Kael becomes a guide. After Kael found peace within himself and began to recognize the transformation he had undergone, a miracle occurred. He was no longer just an immortal being. Now he was someone who could share the light and liberation with lost souls. The understanding of life and death that he had gained made him a powerful and wise guide. One night, as Kael meditated beneath an ancient tree, he sensed the presence of a soul. It was a soul trapped in regret. Much like Kael had been before, this soul could not move forward, burdened by past mistakes. As the soul approached, Kael did not feel fear. Instead, he felt deep empathy. "You are not evil," Kael said gently. "You are just a soul lost in darkness, just like I once was." The soul looked up, eyes filled with tears. "I cannot forgive myself. What I have done cannot be fixed." "There is nothing that cannot be fixed," Kael replied. "Forgiving yourself is the first step to liberation. When you let go of regret, you will see that compassion and forgiveness are the true paths to freedom." Kael was no longer bound by fear or desire. He knew that forgiveness was the key to unlocking the door to liberation. After helping the soul realize the value of self-forgiveness, Kael saw a light flash in its eyes. The soul began to rise from its body, merging with the universe, completely free of its suffering. This was the first time Kael felt the true power of liberation. He no longer felt alone. With each soul he helped, he felt his own soul brighten. He was not only freeing the beings trapped in darkness, but also finding himself in every action. The great transformation. With the lessons he had learned from Liara and from his own experiences, Kael began sharing his philosophy of liberation with those he met. He was no longer a vampire who only knew how to feed on blood and live in darkness. He had become a teacher, a guide, someone who pointed the way to inner peace. A small village, where Kael had chosen to settle, gradually transformed under his influence. The villagers lived in peace, no longer fearful of the presence of supernatural creatures or ancient curses. They felt a strange energy of calm in the air, and this was the energy of transformation that Kael brought with him. One day, as Kael meditated beneath an ancient tree, he felt a profound sense of connection with the world around him. The ancient tree, which had stood for centuries, seemed to whisper a silent acknowledgement of his journey. As the wind rustled through its leaves, Kael understood that everything, be it human, vampire, or tree, was part of the same cycle of life and death. He had finally found his place in the world, not as a creature of darkness, but as a being of light. As the years passed, Kael's presence in the village became a source of inspiration. People came from far and wide, seeking his wisdom. They did not come to him out of fear, but in search of understanding and peace. They felt his energy, calm, serene, and full of compassion, and they, too, began to change. Kael's teachings on self-forgiveness, acceptance, and the path to liberation spread far beyond the village. He became a living example of the possibility of transformation, showing that even the darkest soul could find redemption. No longer bound by his past actions, Kael lived with a quiet joy, knowing that his true liberation had come not from escaping death, but from embracing life, in all its impermanence and beauty. One day, as he sat on a hill overlooking the village, Liara, the monk who had once guided him, appeared before him. She smiled gently, as she had done all those years ago, and Kael could see the same wisdom in her eyes. "You have done well, Kael," Liara said, her voice warm and soothing. "You have found the light within, and in doing so, you have become the light for others. Your journey has come full circle." Kael bowed his head, humbled by her words. "I could not have done it without you." Liara nodded. "You were always capable of this, Kael. Sometimes, we just need someone to remind us of who we truly are." With those words, Liara disappeared into the wind, leaving Kael alone on the hilltop. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the village, Kael felt a deep sense of peace. He had found liberation, not in fleeing his past or denying his nature, but in embracing it, healing the wounds of his soul, and ultimately sharing that healing with the world. The vampire who had once been consumed by darkness had become a beacon of light. And in that light, he had found his true self. This is a tale of transformation, of a soul that was lost in darkness and found its way to the light. It is a reminder that liberation is not a destination, but a journey of self-discovery. forgiveness, and acceptance. No matter how lost we may feel, there is always a path that leads us back to peace, if we are willing to face our own darkness and embrace the light within. For Kael, and for all of us, the journey is ongoing. We are all capable of transformation. No matter how deep the darkness or how heavy the burden, all we need is the courage to begin, and the wisdom to see that liberation is not about escaping our past, but accepting and learning from it. And so, Kael's story continues, not as a vampire in search of blood, but as a teacher, a guide, and a beacon of hope for all those who seek the light. Thank you for watching. If this story has touched your heart, don't hesitate to share it and leave your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your feedback and bring you more meaningful stories and lessons. Share this story with those who you feel will be inspired. And together, let's spread light, love, and forgiveness. Don't forget to hit like if you found this video helpful and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any future videos. Together, we can build a community filled with love and growth. Wishing you a journey of peace and happiness.